Hello everybody, welcome to the Premier Injuries channel. Today Ben cannot join us, but we are joined by the brilliant Raj from 3CB Performance. We're both Arsenal fans, so this is like a really good stream at the moment. I mean, how excited are you, Raj, with the form of the team before we get into any injury news?
Yeah, I mean, excited. I think it's certainly they're taking that next step when it comes to the way that Arteta wants to play. But he's even said the whole time that I think the plan is there, and we're seeing the plan come to fruition, and the way they want to play, the profiles that they've recruited, that versatility everywhere. And so now you're seeing that. I think the case in point was this past week where you plug in Tomiyasu at left back to deal with Salah, right? And he does it quite well. So you can play multiple ways. You can ask many questions of the opposition, but still within the structure of controlling the game. The only concern I see in general is still being able to maintain that control when you're leading. And I think we saw some of that issue with the team after they scored that first goal versus Liverpool and then kind of sat back a little bit. Whereas a team like City, but City's obviously steps ahead, even in their cycle of development. They're able to still maintain the same level of control regardless of scoreline. But overall, I mean, obviously, very pleased, and personally not surprised.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's amazing to see at the moment with the squad. I think the depth is one of the big things. You know, we're talking about injury news here, and the fact that Tierney, he's kind of been conservatively managed back into the team, and so we saw Tomiyasu there, and his ability to play as a left back, even though he's right-footed. He had Salah in his pocket all game. We weren't playing 100% of our strength in squad, and yet we can still get a result like that. And it's testament to the kind of purchases of the team. But we're going to move on to the first discussion point then, the Gabriel Jesus. And we've got it up on screen. In that game against Liverpool, it looked like he was knocked out. It looked like he had a pretty bad head injury. And then after that head injury, he was allowed to play on. But do you think that he should have been allowed to play on, Raj? Do you think that he was knocked unconscious, or are people reading a little bit too much into it?
Yeah, at first I thought he was knocked unconscious just because the way that the players around him responded. I thought that he was out. He was on the ground, but then I actually saw him right after he went to the ground. He moved his hands, so I that's not okay. He's not unconscious, and unless there was a momentary spell. And then afterwards, I saw the physios were cleaning up something near his nose or cheek. So I think it was more of a reaction to blood than anything else. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that. So, I mean, it was an elbow to the face. It looked like to be more of a contact hit rather than something that would cause head trauma or head injury. Head injury meaning brain injury after seeing it on replay. So I think just based on those aspects, it was more of just a reaction to getting hit in the nose or the cheek more so than anything else.
And would that type of injury keep you out for any length of time? Because we've seen players in the past that they wear those kind of shields for their nose if it's broken. Could we be seeing Jesus with that? And a follow-up question as well was, my concern is the fact that once you get one head injury, if you get one quite soon after, there's a big problem there quite often. So I guess with the first question then, could this type of injury keep him out for any length of time?
Yeah, I doubt it. I mean, you can see in that picture there, he's trying to, at it on his eye area, right? He's holding that to like that, and that's where he got hit. So to me, it's a direct contact to the face. More concerned with potential. I highly doubt it's a fracture or anything. We would have heard about it by now, right? And he would have been in more pain than that in general. So I think he just had a knock to that area. So yeah, I mean, to your point about head injury, yeah, there is a concern if it was a concussion, but it doesn't seem like that's what occurred.
Even if it's not a concussion, we've chatted to the lady from Reason Headwear. She's done amazing kind of research. The subconcussions are also
Yep.
very damaging to the head. It can cause all sorts of long-term damage. I mean, if you were in that kind of situation, you always talk about risk versus reward. Jesus, he looks like he's had a bad knock to the head. Would you be going on the risk side of going, he could have, even if it's not a concussion, which does take time to show up as well, it could be a subconcussion, which then could lead to a more serious head injury. Would you be more conservative in these situations if it was a player under your management?
I think it just depends on how it happened. Like in this case, if I saw, a knock higher up, or I saw some whiplash, right? Then to me, it's more of a concern in general. I think, of course, ideally, risk reward with these, you always want to err away from risk, right? But the reality also is when you're at the highest level of physio, you have to make very, very quick decisions within the context of the game, and also knowing that, hey, there is the risk is going to be different for elite athlete than it is someone else. Whether that's okay or not, that's just the reality of the context that these physios are making decisions in, right? So my guess is that they had some quick testing that they were able to go through, and then based on what they saw, especially if they saw blood like in the nose, someone like that, and he wasn't showing any overt signs, then that immediate concern goes more towards his contact rather than an overt concussion or subconcussion.
So in that Liverpool game, we also saw a couple more big injuries to Trent Alexander-Arnold and obviously Luis Diaz. And just before we get onto it, we started the show with the website. So if people want the latest injury news, head over to premierinjuries.com and you can find all the latest news on there. But we'll move it on to Trent Alexander-Arnold, because that one looked nasty in the initial moment. I've seen you on Twitter kind of arguing with fans about how, should Martinelli got a red? I don't think he should have. But in terms of the injury then, looking at it, the kind of mechanism of injury there looked really bad, didn't it, Raj? But why wasn't something more serious coming out of it? It wasn't a break. It doesn't look like there's ligament damage. So was Trent quite lucky there, really?
Yeah, well, firstly, I didn't argue. It was one comment. To me, it was just a nonsensical argument. The person was trying to compare Emerson Royale's a challenge on Martinelli to Martinelli following through on a cross, right? It's typical Twitter stuff. But anyways, yeah, I mean, there looked to be maybe some twist when Martinelli followed through and hit the inside of Trent's ankle. And the fact that they ruled him out for 2 weeks, or not, he's not been ruled out, but there's some report saying that James Pierce, who's quite reliable, saying that it's potentially 2 weeks, which might indicate some ligament damage. So, but really, I mean, in the course of a game, when you see the level of twist, it wasn't that bad. To me, it just looked like a really bad stamp. But where it was higher up the ankle, it can still be really quite painful. So it's something that he could play on with. I mean, you can. There's many injuries that are when at lower level you can play on through, but then once you sit down at halftime, right? You take your boots off, take off the tape potentially. You can kind of see how bad it is or how swollen it is and get assessed. Then you can be removed from the game. So it doesn't seem like it's too bad of an injury, and it is a contact injury. So yeah, to me, it's not that concerning.
Well, we'll kind of keep people up to date with that. Like I said, check out the website or Ben's Twitter, and you'll be reporting on it as well, Raj, if there is any news on that. But the biggest kind of injury concern of the weekend came from Luis Diaz. So I've got the video up on here, and I thought it'd be quite useful for you to kind of do a bit of an analysis on what's actually happening in the game there. So obviously I've highlighted him in the video.
Yep.
And so this is the initial impact of the injury there. So was it especially bad because his knee was kind of in a locked position? Would that have added to the worry there?
I mean, yeah, it's just really, honestly, it's really hard to tell on this angle. When I've seen the video many times, and it's hard to tell what happened based on the angle, because you can't even see like if Partey's knee hit him. Did the knee jut out, right? It's really hard to tell from this angle. Clearly something happened on this impact to the knee. But again, from this angle, it's really difficult to tell. But in the following, there's certain other indicators that'll tell us more information coming up. So one is here and there. So firstly, if you go back a little bit, right, you'll see the physio doing what we call a valgus stress test, which is testing which is testing the inside of the knee, typically the MCL, the medial collateral ligament. And then you combine that with Diaz. If you roll it a little bit, you'll see him holding the inside of the knee. And that's when I watched the game, that's the first thing that I saw. And I commented on that saying he's holding the inside of his knee. But at that point, I hadn't seen the stress test. So you could think, oh, it's a knock, right, to the inside of the knee. He was allowed to play on. So clearly not, the physio didn't see any over instability in the knee. But then obviously he then came out a few minutes after that.
Is it a good indicator that he could play on, or could that have actually added to the issue as well? You talked a little bit earlier about Alexander-Arnold maybe playing through the pain. Could that have been a situation there where, the kind of emotions, the hormones, or all the kind of things that go on with the brain chemistry, he might have been able to play through just for a few minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. It could have been adrenaline, but I mean, again, also, hands-on testing, it's not an exact science, right? Typically, you're only going to feel a lot of instability if it's a full rupture, if it's a really bad injury. So again, in this case, it's one of those where allowing him to go back and play and see how he responds is actually another indicator for you as a physio, right? How do they respond to it? Because sometimes you'll have a test and the player is saying they're like, oh, it's painful. You'll do it, right? They'll be out, they'll come back in, and then they'll have an issue again. And that's the thing. And there's a lot of gray area here unless it's a really, really bad injury. So in that case, you'll feel like instability right away typically, and the player can't continue. So yeah, in one sense, it is a good indicator that it's not like, let's say, a grade 3 rupture, but there's still a lot of spectrum left underneath a grade 3, right? It could be a grade 1, it could be a grade 1 plus, it could be in between grade 1, grade 2, etc. So
the fact that the timeline is what it is, the fact
Yep.
that it's just after the World Cup coming back, does that suggest to you as well, with MCL injuries, they usually have a good kind of return to play. Does that suggest to you that there's less risk of re-injury as well?
Yeah, typically, I kind of always say if there's one knee ligament you want to injure, it's the MCL. And the reason is because it has very robust blood supply, so it heals quite well. That's why you rarely even see even grade 3 MCL ruptures rarely operated on. For example, Granit Xhaka, I believe, had a grade 3 rupture and he didn't have surgery because those ligaments can actually reattach and heal because blood is the healing factor there. And so the fact that he has, I think it's reported 6 to 8 week return timeline, which does probably, rules him out for the World Cup because you don't want to rush him back. But at the same time, it pretty much gives him almost that entire December to really ramp up to be able to come back, right? So he should be, I mean, there's always that transition back to games, there's always inherent risk there. But in general, yeah, he'll miss the World Cup, but the timing there isn't that bad.
And with these type of injuries as well, we see with the ACL, we've talked to Dr. Matt Provencher talking about how some players can lose some of their athleticism, that ability to sprint, get off the line. They sometimes have to adapt their game. With this type of injury, that's not going to be affected, is it?
Yeah, doubtful. Like I said, with MCL injuries, you see very, very good return to play with it. And Liverpool staff is extremely, extremely good too, so which is a key part of it too.
Now, Ben is not with us tonight, but he has communicated to me. He wants to ask your thoughts, Raj, on Arthur's setback, the Liverpool midfielder, considering the player has also employed his own personal trainer in the hope of, beating the odds, getting back to speed a bit quicker. I mean, what is the situation there that you're kind of reading into it?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, what I always say is that he's a player who hadn't played consistent minutes for a while, right? In general. So his fitness level was already quite low. And then you burn him into Premier League which is a higher intensity level. We know just based on the data, especially when it comes to short burst, when it comes to the quality of the league as well. And so, I mean, for me, you have a guy like that who you bring in last second, doesn't really have training camp to adapt, and you're trying to bring him in. I think another perfect example of that is Thomas Partey, who came in last day. This is a very, very physically robust player in La Liga who missed very few games, right? But that trend, and whereas with Arthur, he hadn't played many games at all recently. So he's at even bigger deficit. So there's always that risk then for an injury. I think the fact that it's a grade 3, it sounds like, that requires surgery is a little concerning, right? And so, but the personal trainer aspect, I think the question becomes, for me, it's not the fact that he has a personal trainer, it's how much are they then coordinating with, with the team. And I would think that they're coordinating a lot, because you really want to know, plan of care, what that person's doing, right? Because if you don't, you can't really manage their overall load and activity level.
Does it complicate things as well, though, because the fact that he's coming from loan from Juventus, so Liverpool, like you said, he's joined the club fairly late, and so they obviously have really extensive, one of the best medical staff in the Premier League. They'll have tested all their other players. Do you think that this complicates the situation with Arthur, that he joined a little bit late? They might not be privy to his whole injury history, and so they kind of bring him back, trying to manage him in a much more physically robust league, and then he kind of gets this. Would this be classed as a soft tissue injury as well?
Yeah, I mean, to your first question, absolutely, it makes it much, much tougher. Then you add in the fact that their midfielder, I mean, injury crisis, right? So they were trying to get him back to play, and so that adds another variable to it as well. And so yeah, and it is a soft tissue injury. I think he has a rupture in his quadriceps. I think it was most likely the hip flexor, is my guess, or the quadriceps that crosses the hip, so rectus femoris. But regardless of that, yeah, it's soft tissue. But there's just so many variables here when you consider all those things, especially for a player who hasn't played consistently. And I keep saying that because you can't replicate match intensity without playing in games. I think that's the biggest thing I try to tell people in general, is that you can't, it's really, really hard to prepare for matches or be match fit if you haven't played in games. And that's why a lot of times I think you're seeing this shift towards giving players at least some minutes in games to allow them to acclimate to that intensity, and not just physically, but mentally as well, because you're not going to go as hard in a training session as you will during a match, right? You're going to try that extra gear because you're on adrenaline or whatever it is. And that, if your body's not ready for that extra, right, that extra amount of effort or capacity required, it can then lead to an injury. So that's why I think you're seeing, you have to balance out getting players into games versus just, don't resting them. So that's kind of one of the drums I'm always beating, or one of the key things I'm trying to educate people towards. Because all you ever hear is, oh, just rest the player, right? Oh, rest the player, rest the player. And then the counterpoint is, how many players have we seen come, Arthur has plenty of rest, bro, but he's still injured, right? So,
it's the bench's fault. That's the reason why he's injured. Blame the bench is that reason.
Yeah, I mean, Partey had a lot of rest over the summer, right? But he picked up the same thigh injury again. Why? You have to build up capacity of the player.
So let's move it on to a final. We're going to link this to an educational thing, as you said there. You've been beating the drum on the issue of kind of acclimatization, but this one's really terribly sad. And we heard this week that Enoch Mwepu has had to retire from football. So what is the latest information on that? What have you read around that? Why has he had to? It's not really a choice. It's medical reasons.
Yeah, so from my understanding, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, it was when he was on international team duty, and he had an issue, and they did a whole workup on him, and they found a congenital heart defect that would have increased his risk considerably for cardiac arrest. Now, that's not my expertise. I'm not a cardiologist, but there's multiple things, abnormalities that can potentially lead to that, right? But in this case, again, it's all about risk reward. I mean, we saw it even with, a different example. Sergio Aguero, right, had to retire due to something that was originally considered when he was younger not to be big of an issue, but then they refound it, but the risk was too high. And same thing in this case, whatever the issue is, clearly the risk of him playing is too high for him to be allowed to be cleared medically.
And this is an issue that is far more common than a lot of people realise. Cardiac problems happen with a lot of young athletes. So, Raj, do you want to talk us maybe through, this is the education side, what can be done to manage those risks, to understand and maybe identify if your friend or somebody that you're playing with is potentially going into one of those situations there? Because Christian Eriksen really brought that to the fore there. A lot of people have learned CPR and things like that, but even identifying a potential cardiac problem is sometimes one or two steps before even getting to that issue of a real kind of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes with cardiac issues, well, it could be difficulty breathing, pain in the chest, all that tends to be a little later on, right? So, and then key things you want to look for are changes in that person's kind of typical ability, right? So if a player seems to be overly tired or hard of breathing, right? Okay, what's going on here? So you want to try to figure out if that player, for whatever reason, just isn't performing physically the way that they normally would, meaning like, again, shortness of breath. Even sometimes you can sometimes with real cardiac issues, sometimes you can even see like swelling in both feet. Sometimes that means the heart isn't working quite as well because you don't have what we call a venous return, and so things of that nature. But in general, I would just look for things that seem like are not normal for that individual, right? In this case, and that being said, the biggest thing, you can really do is, if you have any concern or any young athlete, is to go and get examined, right? And especially nowadays, post COVID-19, we know the studies on that. There's even higher now, rates of cardiac abnormalities due to the virus. So I think you have to be even more in tune and cautious with that as well.
And just for people to understand, I think cardiac problems, sudden heart attacks are one of the biggest killers for young athletes, isn't it? For young people in general, the numbers are really high. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, Raj.
I don't off the top of my head, but I know, especially in high-level young athletes, it's still overall relatively low, but in terms of compared to the rest of the population, the prevalence is higher. And some of that, from what I've read, again, not my specialty, is just because when your cardiac conditioning is so high, it can lead to more development in certain parts of the heart muscularly, which can then lead to certain abnormalities. That's just one thing I've read, but there's multiple underlying reasons here.
Well, that is the latest information there. I hope people found that useful. We wish Enoch Mwepu a fantastic, future career, so that he can still be involved in football in some way. He can do what he is passionate about. But for now, Raj, I'm going to say thank you so much. You're usually here each week. We usually talk about the injury news, and we're most often joined by Ben, but he couldn't be here tonight. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Raj.